Hello guys, welcome to the Doctors of Medicine channel. Today we continue with our endocrine playlist, and today we're talking about my personal favorite topic, oxytocin. So oxytocin, we start by the etymology. So oxytocin is derived from the Greek word which means sharp childbirth. So it's actually called swift childbirth because this hormone is the one that's responsible for controlling childbirth, right? So, what is oxytocin produced? Oxytocin is produced in the hypothalamus by the paraventricular nuclei and the supraoptic nuclei. But then it is then secreted by the posterior lobe of the hypothalamus. Right. So, back to basics. What are we calling the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei and So, from nerve physiology, we know that a collection of cell bodies in the CNS is called a nucleus, and a collection of axons is called a tract. So here, we call these the paraventricular nuclei and the supraoptic nuclei because these are collections of cell bodies in the CNS. Right? Paraventricular because it's adjacent to the third ventricle, right? So this connection, which is just a group of axons that are descending into the posterior lobe, we call it the hypophyseal tract. Why tract? Because we say a collection of axons in the CNS is called a tract, right? So we find that oxytocin is synthesized in the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei, and that it descends into the posterior lobe, where it's stored in the terminals, nerve endings, awaiting for secretion. But between the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei, we realize that oxytocin is mainly synthesized by the paraventricular nuclei and vasopressin by the supraoptic nuclei. Right. So what happens upon stimulation? The posterior lobe will then secrete the oxytocin into the bloodstream. So how then is it going to act? Here I've enlarged a cell for you so that you can see how exactly oxytocin is going to work. Let's imagine that this is our oxytocin that we have released from the posterior lobe. Oxytocin is going to travel all the way over here, and then it's going to attach to this receptor. As you can see, this is a 7-pass membrane receptor, which means this is the G protein. So oxytocin works by a mechanism that we call the GQ pathway. Right. So when oxytocin binds to our receptor, it will activate an intracellular response. So we've got our gamma, alpha, and beta subunits. So these are inactive because they are already bound to GTP. When oxytocin binds, we replace this GTP with GTP. When this happens, our alpha subunit separates from this triad, and it moves to the cell surface membrane, where it will then react on the receptors of phospholipase C. So phospholipase C is what phospholipase C is going to do. When the alpha subunit binds, it's going to activate phospholipase C. But at the same time, phospholipase C is like a cutter, which is going to break this GTP into GDP. When we break down this GTP into GDP, it becomes our alpha subunit becomes inactive, and then we return back to our normal state of GDP. So the activated phospholipase C will then also cleave another transmembrane protein, which we call PIP2. Right. So this PIP2 now is going to be cleaved into two. We have IP3 and diacylglycerol, which we call DAG. What these are going to do, we have got our IP3, which is going to move to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Here at the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it will bind to the receptors. When it binds to the receptors, we have calcium. We said the sarcoplasmic reticulum is an intracellular store of calcium. When it binds, it will cause the calcium to come out into the cytoplasm. What about DAG? DAG is going to move to activate what we call phosphokinase C. So a phosphokinase C, what you call a kinase, is something that phosphorylates or activates. So our phosphokinase C now is going to become active. When our phosphokinase C becomes active, it will start to phosphorylate this ion channel. So when this calcium ion channel is phosphorylated, we are going to have more and more calcium entering inside the cell, which leads the overall effect of this is to increase the intracellular concentration of calcium 2+. But then, what do we know about calcium? Calcium is important for contraction. So this would trigger this will then activate contraction of the cells. And you actually bind to the myosin light chains. Yeah. So the overall effect is going to trigger contraction. Okay, so now we know the pathway. So what are the physiological effects of releasing oxytocin? Here we've got the first one, milk ejection reflex. So in the breast, we realize that in the breast we have got alveolar cells, we have got our lactiferous. So due to prolactin, we already have milk. So imagine that this is our lactiferous duct. Milk is already stored inside this organ. So we know that this lactiferous duct is surrounded by what you call myoepithelium, which is just epithelium that is specialized for contraction. Right. So upon suckling of the nipple, we have activation of these mechanoreceptors, which will then send a signal to the hypothalamus, which will cause the posterior lobe to secrete oxytocin. When oxytocin arrives in the breast, right? So it will bind to the receptors on this myoepithelium, which are equivalent to these receptors. When it binds, it will trigger this intracellular GQ pathway, which will lead to an increase in intracellular calcium and cause contraction of this myoepithelial cells. When these myoepithelial cells contract, it will have an effect of squeezing the milk out. That's why I say the milk, so it will sort of eject the milk out of the lactiferous duct, which is why we call it the milk ejection reflex. Okay, good. Our second physiological effect is uterine contraction. Right. So the same mechanism also happens when childbirth is about to occur. So in the uterus, we have what we call the myometrium. Myo means essentially the muscle layer of the uterus. So what this oxytocin is going to do is going to bind. Imagine that this receptor is on the myometrium. Oxytocin is going to bind on the receptor, trigger the GQ pathway, and will have an ovary effect of causing contraction. So when childbirth is about to occur, we have an example. We have a fetus which is pushing on the cervix. So this pressure that's being put by the fetus on the cervix is the one that's going to send a stimulation to the hypothalamus to secrete oxytocin. So when oxytocin is released, the myometrium will increase contraction. When it increases, even the pressure that's being put on the cervix will increase. This will have a positive feedback effect, whereby signals are going to be sent to the hypothalamus to secrete even more oxytocin, and this will result in more and more contractions occurring. And this will give us this gives oxytocin the name swift childbirth. So this sort of eases or fastens the process of childbirth. Okay. Number 3, we have human sexual response. So we know that during male orgasms, so oxytocin release will actually trigger contraction of the vas deferens and the prostate gland. So when oxytocin triggers this gland, it will actually have an effect of causing contraction. That contraction is going to lead to ejection of the sperms into the urethra and out into the cervix. Right. Good. So even during sexual activity, we realize that oxytocin release will actually increase. So we know that erection, for example, oxytocin can result in erection, and we know that stimulation of the genital organs of the female will actually increase oxytocin production. Right. Number 5, we've got anti-diuretic effect. So we know that oxytocin and vasopressin are both released they are both synthesized in the hypothalamus, and they have a more or less similar structure whereby vasopressin can act around 20% on oxytocin receptors and oxytocin between 0.5 and 1%. So that means oxytocin will actually act like vasopressin in a certain kind of way. So that means oxytocin will have an anti-diuretic effect, which means it will prevent urination. For example, you don't want to urinate while giving birth. Exactly. Even during intercourse, you don't want to urinate. That's good. So oxytocin will have an anti-diuretic effect whereby it will cause the kidneys to retain more and more. So it will act on the V2 receptors in the kidney. That's how you get it. So because it acts like vasopressin, it will also have an effect that we call natriuresis. So this means it will also stimulate those same kidneys to excrete more sodium. So now, what does it mean when you say more sodium is being lost? So in situations where we have high levels of oxytocin, we realize that we have a condition that we call hyponatremia. Right. Inside the cell. Okay. So from here, there are also other effects. So a question can arise. Why is it that all other hormones, they are secreted by the anterior lobe, but then vasopressin and oxytocin, they are secreted by the hypothalamus? They are synthesized by the hypothalamus. Well, it's very simple. Because these two hormones take part in memory. So because they take part in memory, they have to be closer to the brain. We know that vasopressin makes you remember stuff. And we know that oxytocin makes you forget stuff. Because we want the mother to forget the pain of giving birth so that she can have a maternal bond with the child. So oxytocin is there to make you forget the pain. Vasopressin, examples, vasopressin is released in conditions whereby if you lose blood a lot, you release vasopressin. For example, if you had an accident. So if you had an accident, you want to remember that so the next time you cross the road, you know that you have to look both ways. So these two hormones, they are secreted by the hypothalamus because they are both involved in memory. So oxytocin will also have some social influences. Okay, so number 7. So oxytocin has an indirect effect of inhibiting ACTH and cortisol production. Right. Then also, but when it does this, it's actually acting as a vasopressin antagonist. Right. So in maternal bonding, as we have already alluded to, so a study was actually carried out on rats. So rats, when given oxytocin, they'll actually develop a maternal bond with even babies that are not theirs. So we realize that oxytocin is important in creating that precious maternal bond. Oxytocin is also important in areas of like lying. We realize that in lying, whereby lying is benefiting the group, oxytocin secretion will actually increase. And then this oxytocin can actually even be used in some forms of lie detector tests. And B, 2 takeaway points that you should never forget is that progesterone, yes, that progesterone will actually have an effect of inhibiting production of oxytocin receptors. But at the same time, so this happens during the period of pregnancy. Oxytocin will inhibit formation of these oxytocin receptors, progesterone. But also, close to birth, we realize that estrogen will actually increase oxytocin. It will actually increase the number of oxytocin receptors. So, close to giving birth, the number of oxytocin receptors in the myometrium will actually increase. And that means the myometrium will actually be more sensitized to oxytocin, which is why we can achieve uterine contraction with oxytocin. Same thing applies with the myoepithelial cells in the breast tissue. Because we want that the breast be more synthesized after cycling so that it produces more and more milk. Okay, so basically we have just given an overview of everything oxytocin is good for. So what happens when you don't have oxytocin. So when your oxytocin levels are low, you realize that there are going to be complications during giving birth. So we find that most women are actually given an artificial form of oxytocin that we call cytosine, because to aid in the process of giving birth. However, it is also important to note that excess of this artificial oxytocin can actually cause a miscarriage, because we do not want too much uterine contraction. We want just normal. And basically, that just wraps up this segment from the Doctors of Medicine. Stay tuned for more.